The Leek Mound Interpretive Trail is sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration, the Georgia Department of Transportation, and the University of West Georgia. Hi, and welcome to another Leek Mounds Interpretive Trail podcast. If you're following along on the trail, this podcast corresponds to the Not As Seen on TV panel. I'm Jennifer Teeter.
And I'm Marcus Toft.
So Marcus, not as seen on TV? It's usually as seen on TV.
Yeah, well, in this case, we're talking about American Indian cultures and how TV and movies and media tend to kind of skew the reality.
But I thought we were talking about American Indian history in this podcast.
Yeah, that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at some of the different time periods and how life for American Indians at each period was a little bit different. It hasn't always been the same, which is what TV and movies sometimes portray.
Okay, so we're talking about the Paleo-Indian, Archaic, Woodland, and Mississippian periods, which make up pre-contact?
Right, pre-contact, or sometimes it's known as prehistory, basically before written records.
Yeah, and pre-contact is before they had contact with Europeans.
Right, and Europeans were the first people to introduce written records to North America, so that's why pre-contact and prehistory kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, and then on the other side of that, there's contact, or the historic period, which we're going to talk about in another podcast.
Right. Jennifer, the first period you mentioned was the Paleo-Indian.
Yeah, the archaeological record shows that as far as 11,000 years ago, people were inhabiting North America.
Yeah, and the evidence that they found, there's not much of it, but it's mainly like projectile points, stone tools.
Yeah, things made of stone that wouldn't have degraded over time like other wood or organic material. And from all of their stuff, we know that they were hunter and gatherers, so they would hunt things like mammoths, mastodons, and bisons.
So pretty big animals.
Yeah, and then they would also supplement their diet with fruits, nuts, and seeds.
So if they were hunting big animals like mammoths and mastodons, did they use like bow and arrows and like the little projectile points that we're familiar with?
No, those didn't come along until much later. And actually, if you look at a lineup of points, you can see how they've gotten smaller and adapted to different game.
And because these people were hunters and gatherers, they tended to be nomadic, meaning they didn't really have permanent villages, but would move from place to place and follow the game that they were hunting.
Yeah, they didn't really settle like later societies did. In some of the later periods, we'll really start to see permanent settlements as opposed to nomads.
And then the second period that archaeologists define is the Archaic period. And Jennifer, how were these people different than the Paleo-Indians?
Well, hold on, Marcus. I think it's important not to think of them as different. It's not like the Paleo-Indians all died and then the Archaic people replaced them. It was sort of a progression from one period to the next. But there was a change in climate because the glaciers were retreating from North America between these periods. And so the large game animals that existed in North America at the time went extinct and the plants changed. So they really had to readapt their lifestyle to the new environment.
Okay. And I think, like with the Paleo-Indian, the evidence that we have of these people are mainly in stone tools that still exist.
Yeah, mostly.
And like you mentioned now, so with the glaciers retreating and the large game dying off, they're hunting smaller animals, so their points are going to reflect that, and their projectile points are going to be a little bit smaller.
Yeah, and I also think a trend that we can see through all of the periods from one to the next is they just became more adept at exploiting their surroundings. So from each period, they knew better how to find plants or food and just really make use of everything that was around them.
So Jennifer, the third period is the Woodland period, and what sets this apart from the Archaic, or why do archaeologists define this as a distinct period?
The Woodland period really built upon what the Archaic period had set out. The pottery and trade and mound building traditions that were in the late Archaic period really came to a climax in the Woodland period, specifically when the Leek site was occupied.
Right, yeah, we haven't even mentioned the Leek site yet. But this is the period, the Woodland period is when the Leek site was occupied.
Yeah, exactly, and there's evidence of pottery, trade, and mound building traditions at the Leek site, which really characterize the Woodland period.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Jennifer, pottery wasn't invented during the Middle Woodland. I'm not sure if you mentioned that or not, but it was invented during the Archaic. But it first became one they used during the Woodland.
Yeah, and the quality and design really progressed in the woodland period from the archaic period.
And pottery, we'll get into that more in another podcast.
Yeah. And I think as the pottery and the woodland period advanced, it really helped them develop a sedentary lifestyle.
What do you mean by sedentary exactly?
They were able to keep stores of food so they could stay in one place for longer, so there were settlements.
Oh, okay. And didn't they also experiment more with agriculture and kind of raising crops?
Yeah, they cultivated beans, squash, and corn.
And then by having a more stable supply, like you said, they can stay in one place longer and not have to just rely on hunting and gathering.
Exactly, and they were also able to pursue other things, such as pottery design is something that they had more time to experiment with, and mound building. They had more time to build mounds instead of focusing on the essentials.
And there were 3 mounds at the leak site. So like you said earlier, a lot of what was going on in the Middle Woodland period happened exactly at the leak site, like pottery, mound building, something else. Trade.
Yeah, exactly. The people at the leak site were trading within what was called the Hopewell interaction sphere, which we talk about in another podcast. And there are artifacts from the leak site that are linked to the man site in Indiana, and who knows where else they were trading.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at a map of the leak site and all the rivers in different travel corridors, I mean, they could have been linked to places all over the eastern United States.
Exactly.
And another important aspect of the woodland period was a social structure, which kind of became more complex during this period.
Yeah, and this is evidenced in the archaeological record from the mounds. Like, they found burials inside the mounds, and they think that those were important people, like a big man or big woman that might have been the chief of a certain area.
And big man or big woman, when we say it, has quotes around it. I mean, it's not like an extra large person that was buried there.
No, Marcus. It's a normal-sized person of large importance.
You're right. That's a good way of putting it.
And on that note, before we move on to the Mississippian period, the last period that we're going to talk about in this podcast, what I consider my fact of the podcast, the most interesting thing that I learned, was that some people that were more isolated, were living in the woodland period up until European contact.
So the last period that we're going to discuss in this podcast is the Mississippian period.
Well, just like the woodland built upon the archaic period, the Mississippians built upon the woodland period traditions. Their pottery became much more advanced. They created new methods of decorating it. They burnished and painted it. Their social structure was a lot more complex. There was a rise in chiefdoms, where one area ruled over a larger area.
And the Etowah Mound site, which is only 2 miles from the leak site, was the center of one of those chiefdoms.
Exactly, yeah. The Etowah Mounds are an example of Mississippian mounds. They were flat-topped and geometric in shape, whereas the woodland periods were round-topped. And
people tended to live on top of them, whereas we don't necessarily know what the woodland mounds were even used for.
Yeah, exactly. The archaeological record shows evidence that there were buildings on top of these mounds in the Mississippian period.
And Jennifer, another important characteristic about the Mississippian period, this is the first time that we see full-fledged agricultural practices.
Yeah, maize or corn became the predominant crop, and corns, beans, and squash were supplemented by hunting and gathering.
Right, and with more of a stable farming practice, really, villages became bigger and more permanent because, like you said, they supplemented hunting and gathering rather than that being their main source of food.
Exactly. And if you would like to learn more, we used The Woodland Southeast, edited by David G. Anderson and Robert C. Mainfort Jr. to research this podcast.
As always, thanks for listening.
The Leak Mounds Interpretive Trail project was done in partnership with the City of Cartersville and Bartow County. Music by Tommy Wildcat.